Economists should have done much better during the COVID lockdowns, but they did not. On average, they performed almost as badly as the doctors. So our job is as an economist to see what others can't see, or are really not trained to see. They can see if they wish. They should have understood the information problems that are chronic during lockdowns and things like that. There is nothing in the world that has no trade-off. So there is no policy that is simply one-sided. What I assumed is a common sense thing like a cost-benefit analysis. It turns out that it is not common sense or whatever to a vast number of medical professionals. Why the public health doesn't want to do a cost-benefit analysis? Because they believe only ethical analysis is appropriate in such a case. Public health has always been the one that rejects the idea of a cost-benefit analysis. And I think that's where I guess Bentham becomes significant for public health. He talks about the sinister interests of the government bureaucrats. Even a worst and the worst bad quality CBA is far superior to a no CBA. You're not doing only for the elites or anybody. You're considering everybody. Let's assume that, the masks work. Then the question is, how many lives are they saving? Sorry, you're not doing public health. We are the only irrational animal. I do not imagine any monkey getting panicky about COVID, right? I would argue that the classical liberal person is the guy who says, hold it. What is the optimal situation in this case? What are the trade-offs? What are the information issues? We had this so-called hotel quarantine in Victoria and Melbourne, complete disaster. They go to sleep, they walk around with other people, they're the ones so-called spreading the disease. So everyone in the quarantine caught the COVID. I started thinking about this and I realized these guys have no evidence, and I've been asking them, where's the evidence? And so they are almost behaving like those Marxists who are saying, no, focus protection will work. It is our belief. I believe that ultimately you need proofs for every single statement. Quarantine is a deadly remedy. I wouldn't go back in time because I believe that I made the same mistake. I then reviewed afterwards after I got the information. It's not possible to implement it. So the idea here is that as scientists, we need to really review. You are an economist, you don't understand public health. They're completely mistaken, but the problem here is that mistake is very problematic. At the end of it, we want to have a discipline that we could compare with genuine science.
Hi, today's either October 10th or 11th. It's not Schrodinger's date, but we have the international date line for our date today with Sanjeev Sabhlok, who's in Australia. And so that's how things work. You figure it out. Sanjeev is great at figuring things out. He's one of my favorite economists. I collect all the baseball cards of economists, and he's up there. He is currently working on the missing chapters from economics. And it's one of those things. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts of economics, economists, where it's going, and why they're "quote unquote" missing chapters. What is it you're trying to fill in? And then we will circle back to lockdowns and how economics did during that period.
Excellent. That's a really good point, because economists should have done much better during the COVID lockdowns, but they did not. On average, they performed almost as badly as the doctors. Now, the problem here, Randall, is that I can fully appreciate doctors not understanding the complexities of human interactions and what are called human factors and information and incentives. I can fully understand because they have a full load of medical stuff to study, and I know the volumes I've seen them. I've been to medical schools and borrowed books from time to time, and I also have a few of these medical books with me. They're very extensive, and some amount of knowledge needed, an extensive depth of knowledge to master medical science is of a completely different caliber or a requirement to what is required by economists. So the economist is basically looking at what I say is the invisible. What I didn't say that. Many others have said that in the past, Bastiat and others. So our job is as an economist to see what others can't see or are really not trained to see. They can see if they wish. So the point about economists, why they should have done better is that they should have understood the information problems that are chronic during lockdowns and things like that. So you don't know what's going on in which place, and you can't customize the treatment, let's say medical treatment, to an individual. They should have also known about the incentive issues, which are chronic in these kind of situations, where people are either falsifying information, uh, deceiving others, or just being human and therefore making errors. So that's the typical human behavior. And so quarantine is breached as a result, whatever, the kind of quarantine we might impose. And the third part was the trade-offs that economists are really trained on. They trained in the concept of trade-offs. So yes, there's some benefit from XYZ thing, but there is nothing in the world that has no trade-off. So there is no policy that is simply one-sided. Whereas public health practitioners and doctors in general are fascinated by the idea of saving some life. Whereas economists are looking at the whole picture and saying, okay, you can save a life here, or you can save a life there, or you can save a life somewhere else. And there are so many ways to save lives. And how do we standardize these saved lives in the first place? So that's their business, and they've been studying it for ages. And so Paul Fridges has probably the absolute guru in the subject. I don't think anybody in the world knows more about this than Paul Fridges, who has created the well-being methodology that has taken this whole thing to the next level altogether. So economists have always said the greatest happiness of the greatest numbers, but what exactly does it mean? And why do we want to see this kind of arithmetic, which was originally conceived by people like, I would say, Benjamin Franklin and Jeremy Bentham, among others. This is a very common thing, pros and cons kind of a concept. It's not rocket science, but the arithmetic of overall good and bad for society is something that economists have been doing as an analysis for centuries now. And that's the concept of trade-off. So what disappointed me most was that economists on average, the average economist, just gave in to the panic that struck them personally, and they went around talking about, the necessity of these measures, and they became basically supporters. And in Australia, a few hundred of them, including some of them I've personally met and really admired in the past. These kind of economists have signed an open letter demanding lockdowns. So I know there were thousands of doctors in Australia, like about 6,000 of them, who signed a letter in favor of lockdowns. But there were these hundreds of economists, which is surprising. And therefore, I think over the years, and I've been an economist in the government in Victoria for a long time, 15 years. And I've done economic analysis even before that in my various other roles in the government. I've been around there 38 years in the government, so seen this whole business firsthand. And I've sort of come to the view that economists seem to not have enough information in their textbooks on what I call these missing chapters. So the issue for me is it's well known. I mean, it's not something that I should be explaining to them. It's like, hey, about the pretense of knowledge, for example. Hayek's lecture, Nobel lecture, was about the pretense of knowledge. The fact that government is, got to be checked, got to be asked. You are going to ask questions from the government before you accept whatever the government says. This is common sense, okay? The idea that we should have a blind faith in government is what I think was displayed by so many economists, because they said, hey, here is the chief or whatever health officer or whatever they call it in Australia. And this guy is saying that, lockdowns are critically important because of blah, blah, blah. And he is the government. And so we must blindly believe him, right? And I think that's where economists, so many of them, hundreds of them, 95%, I would argue, of economists across the world went wrong, including some of the people whom I really, really admire. I mean, there are people I don't want to name and, shame or something, but really, I'd really admired some of these guys, and they have let me down, essentially. by, and therefore this particular book was one of the many projects that I've been working on. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to pop it up for people here. So here it is on your X post. So here you are at Sabhlok on X, and here's the missing chapters in economics textbook. And I actually have downloaded it already, and I was reading through it. A lot of fascinating stuff here. Your style is breezy. You kind of go through things very easily and nicely. And I think that you have an imprint on the book and things you collect, but it's also, in a sense, kind of the breadcrumbs you leave on the trails you take, so that people can follow along your thinking by picking those up. And it's not an overwhelming or overweening or overzealous book per se. You're kind of quoting and picking things out, and I find the vignettes really fascinating. I was hoping maybe you could cover some of them for us. I'd like to hear, what are your thoughts about Jeremy Bentham? Who is he, for people who aren't familiar? Why is he in this book? And how does this play kind of in the course of history? Some of the kind of more, say, classic thoughts, and how are they playing out today?
Yeah, look, since you mentioned, there are two things you've asked for in this. You'd like to know a broader thing about the book and stuff like that, but also Jeremy Bentham in particular, which is, I sort of want to hold this book here. Can you read the thing, or
Yes.
is it upside
Yeah, we
down?
can see it.
Yeah, beautiful. So this book, I've just purchased it recently, and I just like take it around whenever I have some bit of time to, on my travels or something. It's a brilliant book, very well written, on Jeremy Bentham and Odyssey of Ideas by Mary Mack. And I personally had only heard of Bentham in passing. Here's the thing about Bentham. We have these names I'm sure you have plenty of such names, Galen or whatever, and so many in in Indian medicine.
William Osler, Walter Reed.
The ancient names that you never actually go into details.
I know that. Yeah, physicians, Hippocrates, and
all that stuff. So nobody really has the time to go into deep depth about these guys, and so we assume that they said something sensible, and we just move on. And that's what was my situation with Bentham. I never studied him. I've also done a very extensive review of the literature of on freedom over the past many years, and that's another manuscript that is on the internet called Discovery of Freedom. And in that as well, I was mostly looking at the political side, and I studied people like Adam Smith, of course, and then of course John Locke and Hobbes and others. I didn't really go into Bentham. Bentham became important only now, in the recent past, because of the fact that what I assumed is a common sense thing, like a cost-benefit analysis, it turns out that it is not common sense or whatever to a vast number of medical professionals. And they oppose the whole concept of utilitarianism, and they blacklist it in some form or shape, saying this is all bad stuff and you should be doing ethics and whatnot and so forth. Now, then I had to really pick up Bentham here and there and went into details. And it turns out Bentham is a classical liberal as well. So when I look at the tradition of Hume and Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment generally, plus their predecessors like John Locke and Hobbes and others, we actually find a lot of the flavor of that in Bentham. And so Bentham is a prolific writer. He kept writing, and most of his writings have still not been published. They are found in the form of about 100 boxes of manuscripts sitting in the University College of London library. And if anyone has time, they can read that stuff. But he was prolific, absolutely, right? So he kept writing all his life. He was unmarried till his 80s. He kept writing nonstop. So this guy has a very clear-cut view, which is quite different to that of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was willing to allow the government to intervene where public goods are involved. So the word public goods we use in economics would be, okay, some bit of infrastructure and stuff like that. So that's where Adam Smith comes in as a supporter of government intervention. Generally, of course, laissez-faire and stuff like that. So then comes this Bentham guy who takes on a little bit more, active role in the government's participation in our society, in our affairs. And according to him, as a position that I fully agree, the government should not interfere at all where unnecessarily. So the word is necessary. It's only when the benefits of that intervention significantly increase, are greater than the harms of that intervention, that such an intervention could be conceptualized or allowed. And so that's where the greatest happiness principle comes in. He explains in great length this is basically meant for the public policy rather than for an individual to decide, which individuals can decide whatever they like. That's their personal choice, and no one can talk about it or interfere. But in terms of the political arithmetic, which is called the cost-benefit analysis, he was quite clear that a net benefit is the only reason why a government should be, interfering in our lives, and therefore public health. He is the founder of public health, the theoretical founder. His constitution that he wrote, is this extensive document of hundreds of pages where he explains what the ministers, I think the 11 different portfolios that he talks about, including health and one for public health. I forget the actual word, but he's got public health as a kind of a function of the government. So Bentham is critically important for public health, but public health as a whole, as a universal rule, rejects Bentham. This is very fascinating. I didn't even know about it. I didn't realize why the public health doesn't want to do a cost-benefit analysis, because they believe only ethical analysis is appropriate in such a case. Now, I really don't know where they got this ethics thing from. I sort of been trying to dig up a little bit more into this, and I suspect it's come from the collectivist traditions, and whatever the old theological traditions. I really don't know, because at one time, if you know, Randall, these the doctors and the priests were actually the same person. There was a time when in the medieval era where they were the same, and then they started specializing and separating into two categories. And of course, the barbers came separately from the side and became the surgeons. Finally, the two combined, and the doctors and surgeons combined together, where the priests remained on one side. But the idea of theology, the idea of ethics became embedded somehow, and I'm trying to dig up a little bit more. I don't find too much evidence of ethics in the past, but it became very chronic in public health over the past 120 years. And so what happened is the entire work of the sanitarians was driven by Bentham. Southwood Smith was his doctor, the one who embalmed him, and the one who wrote phenomenally, wonderful essays and writings. The entire report on quarantine was authored by Southwood Smith. And of course, we have Edwin Chadwick. These were two very strong supporters or colleagues of, in a sense, of Bentham. And, Chadwick stayed with him in his last many months. He stayed with him in his house to look after him. So these people understood utilitarianism. They wrote a lot about it. They advocated cost-benefit analysis for sanitation, for example, and they all advocated they both advocated for the abolition of quarantine. Now, why did public health not accept this issue of cost-benefit analysis or the greatest happiness principle? I mean, it seems to me that public health is all about happiness. The total when we in economics, and if you talk to Paul Fridges, he'll tell you a lot more about this, because there are measures in which you multiply the life expectancy of a person with the total number of healthy years or happy years, and that's the final unit of measurement of a person's, how long did you live and how happy were you for most of that duration. That is the measure that we want to look at, and that is the fundamental measure that public health should have adopted, and it did not. And for some reason, it refuses to include any of those broader measures of public well-being as part of its work. So that's the reason why there was no cost-benefit analysis ever undertaken of quarantine or lockdowns or whatever, or any other policy for that matter, except I would qualify the vaccines. The vaccines have had cost-benefit analysis undertaken in the past. And of course, I shouldn't, completely brush aside the work of Donald Henderson and others who talked in the sense of a cost-benefit analysis while rejecting mass quarantine and so on, but did not really conduct any of these things. But the problem has been essentially in public health that they need to really understand that Bentham comes from a very different. I mean, he is coming from the same root thought of separation of state and the church, minimal role of government. However, Bentham authorizes certain amounts of interventions, which, by the way, is what is happening today in all societies, where, as an economist, my job was to assess the cost-benefit analysis for every single policy area, right? Mm-hmm. And so, except for public health and town planning, where again I've managed to get some CBA organized in Victoria, but public health has always been the one that rejects the idea of a cost-benefit analysis, and I think that's where I guess Bentham becomes significant for public health. Now, back to this particular book, where I've actually highlighted some of the extracts from Bentham in terms of there is a claim made in some parts of public health that he's a great supporter of government intervention. No, but he's not. I think they need to understand he's very skeptical. He talks about the sinister interests of the government bureaucrats and the government ministers. He thinks these are sinister people. He has this what is it, pant copy on, whatever the thing he's got, the kind of a jail kind of a thing where people are watching. He has got a similar one for ministers. He says ministers, whatever they do, they should be observed by others. It should be open windows around them. Anything the minister is doing should be transparent to society. Now imagine a guy like that. Is he actually a supporter of big government? I don't think so. He's actually demanding.
No, he sounds more of a populist, actually.
Well, I don't know about populist. He's saying you can only do things which are for the net benefit of society.
Right. The whole concept of utilitarianism is that it has to give a net good. Now, how that gets determined is often difficult because the people who are doing the determining have their own set of goods, and they don't necessarily have the sensors or the sensibility to figure out what's happening to the great underclasses. They're like the tail that gets whipped. The dog moves this way and the tail whips the other way. It's like an alligator. So that the people on the far end get a lot of motion from a tiny bit of thought on the front end, which might be like the alligator reptilian. Insofar as you're populist, it might be difficult in those days because you don't have a kind of the broad reach of that we have now, communication abilities that we can kind of see what people are thinking at any given moment. Back then, it had to be somewhat prismatic, that you're just looking at that class of society in which you live. But that being said, it sounds to me that he's, not so much of an elitist. He's not trying to let kind of elites do what elites do. And, I think what we've had lately is kind of the elites as experts and vice versa, the experts as elites. And we've been led by this kind of monomaniacal, myopic view. And you mentioned that, public health seems to be exempt from these cost-benefit analyses of economics. And that seems to be kind of in part and parcel of the, if we can save one child, you always hear this kind of like thing, but we don't want one child to die. But the way everything gets framed is if we can save one life, then this is worth it. And yes, at any given moment it is. If I somebody's lying down on the street, yes, I stop for one life. But some of the demonstrations we see, is one person sitting down and thousands of people, lined up. One person determining, gluing himself to a painting. We have to save that one life, but we ruin it for everything else. So it's kind of, it becomes a difficult equation. People can tend to manipulate that one life thing, and they, people, they self-immolate. They do all kinds of obstructionist, obscurantist items that can tilt the body politic because we have this, susceptibility to wanting to save one life. So, you don't want over utilitarianism, determined by Stalin, but there has to be some actual cost-benefit analysis in the aggregate.
Yeah, I think the point I'm making, Randall, is that this is not the specialization of doctors. So I think there's really no doctor that I've come across who understands what exactly is involved. So when we start looking at the cost-benefit analysis, we need to go back to the work of Charles MacLean, who actually did the first CBA of quarantine, for example, and demonstrated it's a total disaster. Then we go to the current CBA by Chadwick of sanitation, and we see that it was very positive for sanitation. But at the same time, we need to see that in economics, there have been about 1,000 economists over the past many years, past 2 centuries at least. And Paul Fridges, as mentioned, is at the total peak of those economists in terms of knowledge. These are economists who've spent lifetime studying how to, they understand all the limitations of CBAs. That they've got methods now that are absolutely rock solid and foolproof, as I'd argue. I'd also argue that there is there is a small variation. In fact, I've done a full-fledged lecture on cost-benefit analysis and it's on YouTube, where I've said that even a worst and the worst bad quality CBA is far superior to a no CBA. Why? Because CBAs are transparent. The first thing that you do in a CBA is you put out your document publicly, and you want public to feedback. So you're also doing a vast number of survey methodologies that capture the entire society's averages. So you're not doing only for the elites or anybody. You're considering everybody, and so that I think the concerns that doctors have raised over the past couple of years that I've come across, and there've been many of them, and also in the literature, they're completely unfounded and based on ignorance. So as I said, doctors are not trained in the subject, right? So imagine how long it takes to become an economist. It would take at least 10 years of hard study to become a competent economist who can start advising governments on policy. It roughly is the same time as it takes to become a medical doctor. I really don't see how it's possible. I mean, Jay Bhattacharya is one example of the exception where he's both a doctor and an economist. But it's practically impossible for a normal human being to know both these things together at a very high level. So when we have a person like Paul Fridges, so if you want to discuss the pros and cons of CBA, I can do that, of course. But I think there's nobody superior to Paul Fridges in the world at the moment. The concept I was alluding to is that utilitarianism is a word that should not be used without understanding what is implied. I think that's not the debate here. The debate is the precise methodologies. And people don't understand the methodologies and use the words, loosely, like they use the word quarantine very loosely in the literature, I think then we have a problem. So we need to really get down to the details. And in that sense, as I said, there are textbooks on cost benefit. I don't have a textbook here with me. I could have shown you. But there are textbooks of hundreds of pages with full details of methodologies. So let's just be aware that economists have not been sitting there doing nothing for the last hundreds of years. And when they say a CBA is a good thing, they understand its limitations. If you read, for example, the CBA that Gigi Foster and I did all the initial work, and then she corrected it and so on. It's a very detailed, extensive document, and it's totally transparent. You can see what the assumptions are, and you can see every single thing on every single piece of data, right? If you have objections, you should provide the objections to that particular piece of information. Not you, I'm sorry, saying. If anyone has an objection, that's the process. The process is you churn out a massive, completely detailed document which assesses the costs and benefits. And then you allow the community to respond to that. Now, the problem that I had, and I've written a lot about this in newspapers and come on TV, etc., is that the government, which is supposed to be insisting on cost-benefit analysis for all public policy, did not do any such thing for these lockdowns. And in fact, I believe there's a large number of other things like masks. I get really surprised, and I would say potentially, it just tells me how far away the doctor world is, the medical world is from the world of reality as far as, considering public health is concerned. So there are doctors who are really good who'd say, hey, masks don't work or masks work. But here's a good example of the situation. Let's assume that, the masks work. Let's say the masks so-called work. Then the question is, how many lives are they saving? Okay, and statistical lives, and you always bring the net present value back to today. And then you look at the negative effects of masks. Like everything else, masks also have negative effects. And I think Mark Changzi and many others have put out vast material. And in fact, one of my original documents, I had about 40 negative effects of masks. I've listed all of them. It was provided to me by a researcher in the Melbourne University. So the fact that masks have so many harms, even if they work, we need to look at the total trade-off, right? So let's say they work, they're great, but they also cause harms. Now you need to do the analysis. Public health, however, is one discipline which never does that. I've seen people get excited, oh, masks work or masks don't work. Sorry, you're not doing public health. You're just doing some silly little, imagination, because public health is about the total effect of masks on the entire society. And if you do not wish to even look at the harms in this case, I'm sorry, we cannot have a discussion. So I think that's why I've suggested, just give me a second. Right?
Yeah, I mean, despite the risk of, genital herpes or worse things back in the day before antibiotics, syphilis is deadly over the decades. People still had sex. People can get genital herpes now. They still have sex. There's a huge urge, and people have to, in their own lives, they take these things into consideration. And if you never ever want to get a cold sore, either oral or genital, then you should stay cloistered up, which is an option, but you're going to miss out on a lot. So everyone makes this cost benefit analysis in his own life all the time. This is something we can't but do. We can't leave the home without deciding people make the decisions where they're going to live. Somebody lives in Arizona, they might have droughts. They live in California, they might have earthquakes. They live, in the South, they might get hurricanes and flooding. People have something anywhere. There are people living in, near the Arctic, and there are people living in the equator. And maybe they like it there. Maybe they would change after a few years. But you have to do something in order to live. You can't live, in this kind of cloistered way. And I think people have, I have a few theories about why this has happened. I think this is kind of a form of safetyism, where, again, it's probably also kind of an acceding to the experts that people don't really, knowledge has gotten so siloed, and a lot of the information conduits tend to be esoteric in their language. If you want to read an art journal, it's almost impossible. I mean, you can maybe read something about art in the review, but if you read the actual art journals, they're talking about the epistemology of converse quadratic spaces in the forthright, F-flower, whatever. It's a bunch of words. And then you can read, an engineering journal and not get much of that either. You're going to need mathematics, so forth. So we think, oh, these guys are super smart because they have their own language in one way. And I can't possibly challenge. I can't say what is good art. I can't say what is bad art. I can't say what is good engineering and what's bad engineering. So people have a reasonable amount of caution. I forget who pointed out how difficult it would be to make a pencil. So it's there's a fair amount of expert knowledge in making anything around you. Your headphones, my glasses. I mean, I could spend my whole life making something like this. I could never do it on my own. So we for the most part deal with it because I don't know how to make a subway train, but I get in the subway. I don't know how to make an airplane. I get in an airplane. And so when something like this comes along, it was like, oh well, he's the guy who does epidemics, and not realizing they actually don't see them that often. And a lot of times they're wrong because they can't really be masterful the way you can with a train. You can make a decent car and so forth. But a lot of these things are verging on the theoretical. And when we talk about public health, they're always ignoring the public part of it, which is the public, the people. And they're ignoring kind of the aggregate sense. And most of their decisions, frankly, are wrong. There's a whole argument that public health has not been a public benefit. I put up your timeline of quarantines and whatnot. And just a second ago, I put up the converse opinion, from the erudite Donald McNeil at the New York Times, who was Dr. Fauci's mouthpiece. I think, admittedly, so. He mentioned that in August. That this is the thing that tipped the scales. And I suppose this is kind of a putative Donald McNeil inside, some kind of like moonwalk chamber. And he pointed out early on in the COVID experience, to take on the coronavirus, go medieval on it. And the medieval is not necessarily a place you want to dwell too long. They had all kinds of superstitions and whatnot. A lot of them wanted to get rid of the plague by putting Jews in their synagogues and burning the synagogues down. They had a lot of misguided concepts and restrictive measures served a purpose in the old days. Did they? Maybe. I mean, this is kind of begging the question. I don't agree with his supposition. And then he points out there are two ways to fight epidemics: the medieval and the modern. This would be kind of a cutting against his argument, to go medieval, because we do have a modern. And the modern way is to kind of use your knowledge and whatnot. And here you got a New York Times guy. New York people think they know all this stuff. I didn't put it up here. But so I apologize, I'm going back a little bit. But this is the him in the spacesuit, say, or somebody like him, to go medieval on it, whatnot. So I apologize for talking without the demonstration here, but I think you get the point. And so, kind of glowingly, he talks about the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, and I notice so much envy for the Chinese when people talk about doing things that are quasi fascistic. God, it's too bad we don't have the power of the Chinese to have to kind of tear down a neighborhood and build an apartment building. Too bad we don't have their power to get rid of these people who say who think they own their houses and we want to put a train there or whatever it is. So they were literally welding doors shut. And this guy McNeil, who thinks himself as kind of a classic liberal or leftist or whatever, it's like he's kind of like serving, sees some kind of purpose to this kind of draconian measures and whatnot. It's just kind of really blew my mind throughout the whole time. And this and mind you, they didn't really have any good facts at hand. And the facts that were at hand, in the Diamond Princess, and I forget the name of that aircraft carrier or the naval boat that guys were on, but the Diamond Princess had 3,700 regular people who just happened to have a ticket on a boat for a cruise and whatnot. So skewed elderly and probably wealthy and whatnot. But the children didn't have any problems at all. They didn't even know they had it. And some people turned positive. The data were all there. And even for somebody as kind of like gung ho for going medieval, for somebody like Donald McNeil, the kind of again, it's kind of like the reptilian brain. When an alligator thinks X, he gets scared of something, he wants to get something, the tail can whip, and this whipped so much. The whiplash we got from our toadies, our elite toadies, making these peremptory decisions on top of us, the ramifications still exist. People are behind in their education, they're behind in their payments, and it set society back. We, increased debt, inflated the dollar, and whatever else currencies around there. This is probably a generational miscue, and the data were there, and it really boggles my mind. And I'm sorry for ranting on this, but it just, at the time, I was Diamond Princess time. If you wanted to make an experiment like that, it would have cost you, I don't know, $quadrillion to get everybody on a boat with an unknown virus. But they were there anyway, so you got a freebie, and nobody could capitalize on it. And then you have the brilliant people like Nicholas Nassim Taleb, or whatever his name is, kind of with 3 masks on a plane. Just like nonsensical. I don't get it ever.
Yeah. Which I think brings us back to the topic we had in our previous discussion about irrational animals, which is, by the way, the first chapter of my Missing Chapters book for economics, that we do not understand how irrational we are. As I argue, we are the only irrational animal. I do not imagine any monkey getting panicky about COVID, right? So we have a real situation, clear-cut situation. Our imagination is what leads us to creativity, and our imagination is what leads us to this panic and other things, continuous chronic panic. So, yeah, we have that problem. And I think most of us, I personally did not even think of it, that I'm an irrational human being. I was brought up in the Descartesian methodology of thinking I'm the only rational animal. Well, actually, I concluded at the end of my life now, towards the end, that I'm the only irrational animal as the human being. So this is the first chapter. That's the first chapter of my Missing Chapters book, where I explain in detail why we are the irrational animal, which, by the way, was our topic of discussion last time, which seemed to have attracted a good amount of viewers or whatever. So, yeah, I think that's what we saw with Nassim Taleb and many others, including the gentleman from New York Times and and 95% of the economists and so on. I won't name them and shame them, but really almost all of them went into a state of panic. And the reason they went into panic is because they never thought that they are the only irrational animal. They always have been trained and told that we are the only rational animal. Well, it turns out that when I look at the qualities of rationality, I find them in all the other animals. If, for example, there's a battle between 2 lions competing for a certain territory, they have a battle, one guy wins, the other guy goes away. Okay, that's rationality. You realize who's superior. In the case of humans, that doesn't work. Okay, so we have a continuous chronic problem with humans being irrational in so many ways. So this is where I think a new field of study needs to be pursued, with economists leading on the subject, because they are it's the next insight after maybe Hayek's insight. I hope I'm not trying to exaggerate any of these things, but he showed how little we know about the world and how little we can know. That is the knowledge problem. What I'm highlighting is the rationality problem. And I think I argue there, I've looked carefully, there's no other animal that does what humans do. We do wonderful things, but we also do crazy things. And that's the kind of variation only found in the case of irrational animals. And we are the only ones. So that, I think that's another area. Let's not go there further at this time. We have only discussed it
Right.
last time. Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of veer off a little bit. Something one in your book that interests me a little bit here. Classical liberalism maximizes equal freedoms and facilitates cooperation. So what is COVID lockdown? What is that? How did people react? What would have been the classical liberal approach, and where do you think it falls on this scale if it can?
So a classical liberal approach, as you can look at this whole issue of Marx being both, the extremist as the anti-classical liberal. So, by the way, this liberal is not the American liberal. I hope you're aware of that, because the American liberal is actually a socialist, a progressive.
Yeah.
Whereas
it's kind of the classical liberal is somebody who wants liberation, freedom, liberos.
Absolutely. So, where Hayek would talk about classical liberalism, and why it's not conservatism either. So these guys I mentioned on the top are the guys who look at things analytically. So the thing that you have there, starting with Hobbes, and that's a bit controversial, but I believe Hobbes is important in that category. You have Adam Smith, and I probably will add Bentham there as well now after my readings. But you have Mill, who's a utilitarian as well, and you have von Mises and Hayek, and I'd mentioned Hayek as the person who thinks very analytically about human knowledge, and he would have raised this matter. And in fact, there are a number of so-called libertarians. These guys call themselves libertarians, some of them. They're the ones who basically have highlighted the knowledge problem in public health. They are the ones who actually, when I first wrote my article about the review of public health, I started with the knowledge problem and incentives problem. That basically was published by the Mises Institute. And so my work was a continuation of the work of Mises and Hayek in that sense. What I'm doing now is going deeper and deeper into the subject. And so it goes a little bit beyond in certain areas. However, I would argue that the classical liberal person is the guy who says, hold it. What is the optimal situation in this case? What are the trade-offs? What are the information issues? So classical liberal looks at all these issues and also what can exactly the government do? What is the capacity? We had this so-called hotel quarantine in Victoria and Melbourne, complete disaster. They hired a person who was some kind of a lowly director in their organization and made her into the head of the quarantine. She had absolutely no clue about the whole thing. Like you said, this happens once in a blue moon, the epidemics. Person was hired and put there, and she didn't know anything. So she put out a contract for people to come and run the whole show. And so they ran the whole. And who are these people? They are some contractual people who are supposed to stay there as security, etc. They go to sleep. They walk around with other people. They're the ones so-called spreading the disease. So everyone in the quarantine caught the COVID, right? So the question was, what is the point of a quarantine? Which is one of the good examples of why these things fail. But human failure was not understood by these people. So I guess the classical liberal would look at saying, okay, how exactly are you going to run the quarantine? How are you going to feed this? So Paul Fridges is wonderful insight. He's such a brilliant guy. I just marvel at his brilliance, right? He's the one who raised in the interview with you, which prompted the entire thinking. But people have to eat. But people have to go to hospitals, the sick people. And so what happens? You have the interactions. You cannot isolate the way the quarantine is supposed to theoretically isolate people. You do, and in the book that I've written, book 6, I call it now, but the summary of the book has been published by 5 authors, including Jaya Bhattacharya as well. But, Ari Joff and J.G. Foster and Paul Fridges, that's a paper that's been published on the IZA Labor Economics website a few months ago. And in that, I've gone into some depth to identify the thousands of failures that humans can have in so-called quarantine. Now, you need to really have understood these things before you start jumping into quarantine, right? So what has happened was that the classical liberal will say, okay, hold on. how is the government going to implement this? It's all fine. And you got a theoretical model. So there are the so-called models from Grattan Institute or some other institute, Burnett Institute, and of course, Neil Ferguson, etc. There's models that quarantine works. Okay, but how exactly do you implement quarantine? Does Neil Ferguson know anything of these things? Does he know how to implement a quarantine? Has he ever done a quarantine? Does he know that he has to, feed the people? How is he going to feed the people? They're not like chicken or something that you put them inside and then lock them up and throw away the key. It's a very complicated business, right? This business is what I call management, is businesses of administration, and these are the fields that are completely like a blind spot for the medical science. When medical science, or people like Ferguson, who's not even a doctor, he's basically a physicist who does some silly mathematics. These kind of people, when they are busy throwing these ideas and the press is picking up these things, as so-called experts are telling them that, they haven't gone into the details to find out how exactly this whole thing is going to work. And that's where the classical liberal is very important in that chart we just saw that he showed. I would argue that the classical liberal is basically the person with an open mind. He's asking questions all the time. He's asking for proofs. He's saying, okay, what is going to happen? How's it going to work? Whereas the other extreme are these so-called Marxists or the statists, the big state guys, who are demanding that I want to have a quarantine. I will have it regardless. I will do it. It's going to work. And I would actually now add a thing even for my, the ones I have high regard for, the focus protection guys. I've been asking them, guys, I don't think your focus protection is going to work. And it's not me who started this discussion. It's actually happened internally in a private email with somebody else I'll talk about later in some other occasion. But I started thinking about this, and I realized these guys have no evidence, and I've been asking them, where's the evidence? And so they are almost behaving like those Marxists who are saying, no, focus protection will work. It is our belief. And they have been putting out stuff again and again, repeatedly saying that it has worked. But I've raised the question, sorry, it's not worked. I've got so many examples I can show you it's not worked. And I can give you 1,000 reasons why it will not work and it'll cause more harm than good. So why are you not providing me with your proofs?
Well, right. So I understand. No, I get your point. Contextually, I think it was, people, I think it was the fact that they were not allowed to say it. They weren't allowed to hold the opinions. And I'm not sure whether they were absolutely right or not, but they weren't allowed to experiment it. They would, in a better world, they would have come up with a theory and then found out how it was working. We have enough cities in this country, and they're different enough from each other that we could have done many different types of plans from different places. And one of the benefits of our federalism, which is kind of a misnomer, it's really the states' rights, from the states having some jurisdiction, is that you can do different things. Even North Dakota did some things differently from South Dakota. They're almost perfect experiments. They have the same size population, same geography practically, and one kept the schools open longer than the other. And you could do an experiment side by side. So there was clearly room to do focused protection in pick a state. If they didn't want to do it in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, they could have done it in Montana or Nevada. Who knows? There's lots of room. And there's different kind of stylings in different places, and even within a given state, you can do different things. So, but the fact that it wasn't allowed to happen. So I cut focused protection a break. If people want to go back and slay that, it's a little bit masochistic, because I think the real enemy was elsewhere. And it's the fact that as soon as somebody came out against the monopoly, the monomania, the maniacal monotheistic approach that they had, where they were the science god themselves, and you had to bow down to them, kind of the Aztec approach, then there was an issue. And so if focus protection wasn't perfect, it certainly was different, and it certainly would have been better than what was happening. And then you could move on from that. You could have, other countries coming in with data and whatnot, but certainly we needed some bridge, away from the kind of, self-inflicted, paint yourself in a corner problem that we had. Nobody could get out. It was not a great thing that George Floyd incident happened. I think his death may not have been preventable. He had the technical term, a crap load of fentanyl in him, and he flouted to the police. Whatever. He didn't deserve to die. So, but all of a sudden, public health, we're like, oh, it's important for everyone to get out there in crowds. 2 days before that, it was, they had this motorcycle convocation in North Dakota. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, there's like 80,000 bikers who get together, and that was a bad thing because they're bikers. And then 80,000 people get together in downtown Minneapolis. It's a great thing. But this kind of like their kind of hold on reality started to be questioned because their concept of public health was, I suppose, in a sense, slightly more rational. They were factoring in other things aside from just the virus. And if people want to get out and they want to grieve, they want to protest or whatever, those are also important things. And some things, it's not just merely about quantity of life. There's quality of life and how you live. If I had the choice of living, in a zoo cage and get to live to 150 versus, getting to live to, whatever, 75, but I can do whatever I want. I mean, there's quantity of life. There's all different kinds of measurements. And this kind of like applique where everyone is, you're killing Granny. Like, I kept Granny alive in our basement. My mother-in-law, may she rest in peace, she, lived all through COVID in our house for the last decade or so of her life. And she passed through COVID and died from other reasons later. But nobody wants to kill Granny. But on the other hand, you can't kill your grandkids, opportunities and so forth, 20 of them for, saving, a few months on Granny's life. I mean, nobody wants to do anything purposefully, but in terms of these economic forces, this was a horrible equation, pretty much done by, I don't know, people who were either devious, self-protective. I mean, I think Dr. Fauci had a guilt thing with, because his fingerprints were all over Wuhan. He needed to change the narrative and come down as some kind of hero. And I think the only way he thought he could do it is somehow winning this fight, and make the beast bigger so he would seem like the bigger hero. I think there's, in all these equations, I love Milton Friedman and I love this clarity of thought, but oftentimes what we're up against is lack of thereof. You're talking about irrational animals. Yes, obviously, people, cling to their ideas, their emotions, and those things tend to be very, heavily intertwined. Fortunately not for us though.
Well, we don't know. I personally have, gone through all sorts of experiences in my life, and so I wouldn't know about that. But back to the issue of, in fact, the original part of the COVID, where I actually personally also felt some panic, right? And I could feel the thing evolving. Nevertheless, I think I've sent you a link now. If you can just open that for a second. I want to bring you back to the issue that I raised, because I think it is important at this stage of our development in society. We do need to review our positions. So I've sent you a link. If you can open and share.
Yep, I will.
That's basically an article that I wrote for the Times of India blog on the 6th of March 2020. Effectively, that was focus protection. Effectively, in every single way, that was focus protection. And so, what has happened in this case is that I fully agree with you that was a more reasonable approach. And I fully agree with you that seemed to be plausible based on, standard policies of risk management or whatever. And so I stuck with that for quite some time. I believe that was right, and I stuck with it. I also fully supported focus protection as the right approach. The problem has been, I'm not at all, I'm fully in the highest regard for the authors of the focus protection. Let me just say that among all the people in this planet, these are the very best, right, who performed the best in COVID. And of course, Anders Tegnell. Now, the problem that I have here, Randall, which I'm referring to with regard to that chart that you just saw, on one end are the classical liberals who keep asking questions. And on the others are the socialists who say, no, you can't ask questions. We are right, absolutely. Is that I believe that ultimately you need proofs for every single statement. And yes, of course, they could not have done a test, a random test of between one area having focus or the other not having. But there are further problems to that. Let me just elaborate for a second. Okay, just give me a second. That I mentioned earlier that you need to understand the details. So what exactly is focus protection? What does it entail? In my article, I had actually made a very specific, precise clarification of what it entails, right? And it was implementable if you follow that, article. But the declaration per se doesn't tell you exactly what is meant by that. And I think the point that I raised about the director of health services in Victoria being made in charge of the hotel quarantine in Melbourne is the doctors have not been implementing, have not been managing people, do not have any knowledge of how these things work. And so unless you go into the detail and have a manual of what exactly is focus protection, you could be talking out of your hat for the whole of your life and no one knows what you're talking about. And I think that's one of the issues that I have. The second issue I do have is that by now I have dug up more than enough information. I would argue the information that I've dug up is absolutely incontrovertible, that quarantine is a deadly remedy. It's a quack remedy, no matter, not just for the things like plague quarantines, but also for all things like flu quarantines, etc. So we're looking at a situation now. I'm looking at it personally from a completely different perspective to what I had when I wrote that piece on the 6th of March, 2020. By now, I know that there's been hundreds of wonderful doctors in the past, in the 19th century, who criticized quarantine and who actually went in the kind of detail that I talk about now, and Paul Fridges talks about now. They'll actually analyze all that stuff and say why it won't work. Okay. So my point is that now that we have all that information and it's been published effectively, why is it that the authors of the GBD are unwilling to review their position? I'm only asking that they review. If you're asking the lockdown people to review their position, I think we are also entitled to ask the GBD people to review. I have reviewed. Okay.
Okay. So fair enough. So what exactly would you have them do? What do you think are the actual flaws in it, and what would have been worse than what we had?
I wouldn't go back in time because I believe that I made the same mistake. So I actually, as I cited this thing so that you're aware that I made exactly the same recommendation. Okay.
Right.
So I then reviewed afterwards after I got the information. So I'm not saying that's a good thing to have done. I'm saying that's what happened in the course of events. That was the best that could have been done. Their recommendation was definitely superior to all other recommendations.
Okay. So, and what's the worst part about what they recommended?
It's not possible to implement it. So the worst part is that they have the data now absolutely clear. There is no possibility of implementing such a thing. And the harms are guaranteed.
You couldn't implement what? What things could you not have implemented?
Well, the first thing is it's not clear what they mean. If you look at carefully at the document, it's a very short document. You can't really be clear about that. But as you look at the kind of, if you wish, I can have a separate discussion to show you and analyze why that cannot be implemented. So it's not defined, well defined, and it cannot be implemented under any circumstances in a universal as a society as a whole. So that's in fact, if they had done this experiment, let's say one state was to the other, they would have actually concluded the same thing, that there was no possibility. Yeah. Everybody would have caught COVID anyway. They wouldn't have saved any lives. They would have caused a lot more harm. Okay. So the idea here is that as scientists, we need to really review. We make mistakes. And I kept on saying, I made a mistake. I made many mistakes. And I think we should admit mistakes. The issue with science is that it is all about saying, okay, let's now move on to the next step. So I think I'm recommending that they move on to what I call the abolition of quarantine declaration. There is a